This is the CFF Sites Week 7 College Fantasy Football Show. I am your host, Joe DeSalvo, and what another great weekend of games. This season is certainly spoiling us nonstop, weekend after weekend after weekend. It's what makes college football so great. So many games, so many different windows. Another great, well, I can't say great, but another solid slate this weekend, but just man, unbelievable games going on right now. And that's making for a lot of dramatic finishes in some of our college fantasy football leagues. And look, we were just talking about over the last couple of weeks, you've got to be able to trust your eyes, right? Like what you see is probably what we're going to get. And here we are, we going into week 7, and it's like, you know, you have to take fewer and fewer chances, fewer and fewer risks. And sometimes you do have to make that decision on a player that may have the higher floor versus the player that maybe has the higher ceiling, but the lower floor, right? And I think where I'm getting at is there are things that we know that's been proven, we've seen it, and some players have been consistent. We know what we're going to get. There are some things that we think we know, right? And that's a good space to be. And yet there's still some things that we know, and that's where we really need to be careful moving into the second half of the college fantasy football season. We're going to get into a little bit of that. Go back and look at the week 6 slate, my takeaways from last week as we move forward into the season. And before we do that, just want to start with the 4-in-1 Super Fantasy League. Look, over 80 teams registered. It is in full motion. We've got the total points league now. That is 6 weeks in the book. We've got the two halves tournament, which just finished the first half. We have a champion there. I'm going to give a shout out. We've got the eliminator now in full swing. We have the head-to-head tournament started, and now starting this week, the second half tournament. So while I'm mentioning that, let me just kind of give a shout out. We have a new overall leader in the 4-in-1 Super Fantasy League. ND Base 2001 takes over the top spot over Gulf Coasters, over Chew Bacon, over Joe Chimo, and over Joe Haddix. Those are your top 5. 24 points separates 5th place from first place. 4 points separates first from second. Guys, I know there were a rule change this past year, but whatever's happened, this league is super tight. I'm looking down at the list right now. I'm going 16 deep, and the top 16 teams in the total points league are all within 100 points of one another. One bad week here or there by a couple people at the top, things can get really wonky. And here's what I mean by that. This is why I say it's wide open. On last week's show, I was referencing how there was a team that was in the semifinals of the first half tournament. Not only did they lose that game, but they got put out in the eliminator that week. Well, we had the same thing happen again this week, where one of the teams that was in the championship of the first half tournament not only lost that game in which they would have been guaranteed money, but they were also had such a bad week, they were eliminated in the eliminator. Now, New Life head to head, I think they're still alive. Second half tournament, you get New Life as well. But congratulations to CP McCon, who is the first half tournament champion, and he'll be sitting there all season long, waiting until we get to week 13 to see who his opponent is. The winner of the second half tournament, they will meet in the championship. So we have the total points eliminator, first half tournament, head to head, everything in full swing. But I just wanted to give a shout out to everybody in the 4-in-1 Super Fantasy League that's up there at the top. That is a very tough league to win. The stakes were increased this past year. I'll tell you, it's hard to win more than one of those leagues. But we've had some guys that have done it before in the past. Let's see if it'll happen again. But with all that being said, we move into week 7. And as we look back on week 6, There are some things we know, like I mentioned earlier. There's some things that I think we know, and there's some things that I think we really think we know, but are we really sure? So let's get into it. And first of all, I just want to start off, and I'm going to go in the order of the games last week. So it's going to be the non-power conference, power conference. It's just going to be a mix as I go right down the list. And just want to start off with the early week games, and we're talking about Western Kentucky quarterback Maverick McIvor, and really just Western Kentucky on a whole, right? I think when you look at Western Kentucky, they remind me a little bit when I think about the narrative that's playing out of North Texas. Western Kentucky's winning games. They're not necessarily doing it by chunking the ball all around the yard and throwing for 400 yards every game. Maverick McIvor kind of teased us out there with that Western Kentucky offense. He had 8 touchdowns in the first 2 weeks of the season. Last 4 weeks, 4 touchdowns. And I cannot blame or argue against anyone that's looking to move on from Maverick McIvor. At this point, I do think there's value in there. It's going to be more of a spot start for him. Are you willing to roll the dice on that? Bench depth, yes. Matchup, you've got to play it. Again, we're looking for consistency. And at this particular point, Maverick McIvor just hasn't given it to us. And we've mentioned this with Drew Mestimaker from North Texas on last week's show. Now you talk about somebody that we do know is San Jose State Danny Scudero. And I have to be, I'm going to go out here and just, it is what it is. Just going to come off of that cliff. I had a lot of doubts about Scudero before the season started. I just really, it wasn't in me to think that a 5'9", 174-pound receiver was going to be able to put up numbers that the wide receiver one and match the numbers that wide receiver one at San Jose State had last year. He's got 4 games of over 130 receiving yards. I was wrong. And it's Danny Scudero, and he is one of the top weekly performers at the position, and there's no reason to believe why he will not be from this point forward. One note I did want to mention from the San Jose State game, looks like they've got some attrition at running back, Bates and Chalk. I'm not sure either one of those guys may be available for the rest of the season moving forward. Steve Chavez Soto did have 71 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns last week against New Mexico on 14 rush attempts. And I think that's a name that we need to watch, because if he has another good game again, that could be a player that guys go in on the waiver wire. I want to revisit Army, because Army this year, look, when we think about Bryson Daly last year, he was just like, he was God level, right? He was God tier in college fantasy football last year. And then we get this year, Dwayne Coleman projected starter. Then we're a couple of games into the season. And then, what was it? Cale Helams had a breakout game. Then there was Helams where he started and Coleman wound up coming in. You have to stay away from Army quarterback right now, even though when one guy gets the bulk of the work, he's going to put up numbers. The problem is that 3 times this year, the guy that started at quarterback for Army did not finish the game as the quarterback or the highest scoring producer at the quarterback position. And I think that's worth noting, because in my opinion, that's where you have to stay away. Air Force now. Look what we know. Liam Zarka, right? And I was a little cautious to beat the drum too loud last week after those back-to-back performances. But now we've got 3 consecutive games in which he's passed for at least 200 yards and 2 touchdowns and rushed for 100 yards. Here's where, if you're a college fantasy football player, you have to be careful just talking about how a bad draft ruins your season. Because it's guys like Liam Zarka that can completely change the trajectory of a league. If this guy continues to generate fantasy points at the pace that he started after 3 starts, this guy is going to end up on a roster that's going to be one of the top fantasy teams at the end of the season. And that's what we love about college fantasy football. Your draft is not killed by a bust pick, because there are so many good waiver wire additions. We go through them every week. It's just life in the college fantasy football world. And for those of you that have been here for a number of years, you're used to it. You know the game. And for those of you guys that have just gotten in the last year or two, welcome to the waters. It's warm, it's deep, but man, I'll tell you, what a fun game to play in. And Liam Zarka right now turning fortunes around for college fantasy football owners. Kansas State. Dylan Edwards, remember when he left the game against Iowa State in that week 0 matchup after fielding that punt, been nicked up, didn't, we haven't seen him. Then he comes out of nowhere and has that 100-yard performance against Central Florida a couple of weeks ago. He follows that up with a 26-yard performance against Baylor. He did reach the end zone, but here's my takeaway as I look at Kansas State. Kansas State's just a struggling team right now. Really hard to say that because Kansas State has been so solid for so long. Avery Johnson, man, I've cooled on him as a quarterback. I'm just not sure he's the answer for them. But when I look at Dylan Edwards, the first thing I think about is that I just do not think now, because so much of the season has gone by, Kansas State hasn't looked great. I don't think there's any need to overwork Dylan Edwards. I just don't see where he's going to get 15 to 20 touches consistently on a week-to-week basis, and therein lies the issue with starting Dylan Edwards if you're willing to roll the dice with him. Now, we talked about some guys that have cooled. Ohio quarterback Parker Navarro. I remember that week 1 matchup, he had 4 touchdowns against Rutgers. And we looked at the schedule, and at that particular point, we just said, Parker Navarro is matchup proof. Since that time, he's only produced eight touchdowns in the last 5 games. So he had 4 the first week against Rutgers. He's only had 8 combined in the last 5 games. And he's not really doing what we thought he would do coming out of week 1. And I can see where some fantasy owners are cooling on him and saying this guy may need to be on my bench for a little while if I've got better options at the quarterback spot. Now, as you get better options, again, Liam Zarka, waiver wire, right? And all of a sudden, Pitt goes to a freshman quarterback, Mason Heinschel, I believe is how you say his name, not sure. 323 yards, 4 touchdowns this past weekend at Boston College. Now, here's what I say, and I've said this before in other shows. You do have to be careful sometimes on jumping on a guy too early just because they caught lightning in a bottle one week. Is that the case? We shall see. Here's what I would say. Let's see what he does on the road at Florida State against a Seminoles team that needs a win after their loss against Miami. But depending how he looks in that matchup, let's not lose sight of this. Following that FSU matchup, at Syracuse, North Carolina State at home, at Stanford. Not a bad 3-week stretch right there for the freshman quarterback. As you get later in the season, though, you do have to worry. You've got a bye week, you've got Notre Dame, you've got Georgia Tech on the road, and Miami. I would say if he's going to pay dividends, let's give him a look in that Florida State game and see if he's worth starting for those matchups against Syracuse, NC State, and Stanford in the following weeks. Clemson. Never mentioned Clemson during that stretch run. But I'm glad that you guys that have hung with Cade Klubnik are finally getting some production. At least three touchdowns for Klubnik in back-to-back weeks. You have to at least start feeling encouraged about his potential moving forward, at least through the end of the year in the Clemson offense. Let's go to Illinois, though, where Khalil Valentine, 95 rushing yards, and a touchdown in that win. Has he ascended? Did that performance, has he taken over the running back 1 role from Fegan and Lafferty? Don't know. It's worth noting, but we do know that Illinois offense, if they do get a workhorse, they'll lean on him. Let's see how that plays out. Interesting to me, based on that performance, we could have seen Valentine ascend to the top of the depth chart, and that would be interesting to see his workload moving forward compared to those other guys on the roster. Now, Wisconsin, here's one thing that I want to say. Like Wisconsin's offense, the running game never did come back, never lived up to what we thought it would be. Dylan Jones, two rushing touchdowns on the season. I think they have five as a team. He's got the only two rushing touchdowns at the running back position this year. To me, Wisconsin, complete loss. I have moved off. I think everybody else have, but I just thought that that was an interesting note. However, we go from Wisconsin to Cincinnati. Remember, Cincinnati had that season opening loss to Nebraska, close game. And I know I've been on the preseason show that Mike and I were doing where Cincinnati guys were my sleepers last year because they had the entire offensive line coming back. And I was like, man, rebuild offensive line. I'm off of Cincinnati. I'll tell you this. After watching Cincinnati play for about 3 games, I'm on Cincinnati. I'm on Brendan Sorsby. I really like him as a fantasy option. And I'm looking at Cincinnati right now thinking Central Florida, Oklahoma State, Baylor, next 3 opponents on the schedule. I can see Cincinnati being unbeaten going into November. Road game at Utah. I think Brendan Sorsby is almost a must start for the next 3 weeks. If you have him, take advantage. Wake Forest, Damon Claiborne. Again, another player, here was a guy that was nicked up week 1 against Kennesaw State. He came in against that FCS opponent and just blew the roof off. Some fantasy owners started him. Some of them, erred on the side of caution, sat him. I remember my comment in my notes and observation was perhaps this might be Damon Claiborne's biggest week of the year, and nobody may have started him. Then he got injured after scoring that touchdown in the overtime game against Georgia Tech that lost. And when they lost, and there were a lot of people wondering if he was going to play this past week, and he did play. I think he had an arm injury, upper body injury, and I believe he left this week's game with a lower body injury. And here's my take on Damon Claiborne now. This is the third time it seems like that he's been dinged up, and I'm not sure it's the same injury all 3 times. This is a guy that now, when I look at it, I don't know if I would have him in my roster. And he may not even be get cleared to play next game. Who knows? But this is starting to worry me now. 3 times Damon Claiborne has been injured. And it seems like all different injuries. And we'll see where that goes. But I'm losing faith on Claiborne because of the health issue. Another play I've lost faith on. We'll go over to the MAC. Western Michigan running back Jalen Buckley. And I was high on Jalen Buckley in the preseason. And I have to tell you, I don't know if maybe injury is the same thing. Again, there's some things we know, things we think we know, and things we think we know. And this falls into things that I think I know, but I'm not sure. And it's just interesting that Buckley carried the ball 30 times in their week 2 matchup against North Texas. I think he even had like a number of 6 receptions. He was targeted out of the backfield 6 times in those first 2 games. After those first 2 games, I know he was questionable game, missed a game. But he's only got 29 rush attempts, I think, in the last 3 games. He had 30 against North Texas alone. And is he banged up? I don't know. But from what I'm seeing right now, I don't have any faith in Jalen Buckley right now. And what you're looking at is that the quarterback for Western Michigan is vulturing all the touchdowns anyway. And I feel like right now, Jalen Buckley, if you have to risk losing a player that could explode over the next 6 or 7 weeks to make room on your roster, he's the guy that you have to take that chance with right now. Oklahoma State, I only want to bring up Oklahoma State because when I was doing projections, I was like, man, they're a mess right now. The only reason why I bring up Oklahoma State is Sam Jackson. Remember, converted receiver, used to play quarterback, maybe getting reps at quarterback now. That's interesting. Does that put him in flex conversation mode in some of the deeper leagues? Possibly. Would you want to go out and do it and add him and start him? Maybe not. Would you want to add him with the possibility you can get him at wide receiver designation for future weeks if you have the roster depth? Those are the types of move that you make ahead of time to have it, to get it, so you don't have to outbid someone or get someone off the waiver wire. That could be a player that's worth noting if you have some room, maybe to just stash wide receiver eligibility that could be getting snaps at quarterback. It seems like they had packages for him last week, And with the way with Zane Flores' condition, it seems like that Jackson may only get more snaps at quarterback moving forward. So just something to note. Another thing I think is interesting to note too is Appalachian State wide receiver Jaden Barnes. He had 24 receptions in the first 3 games of the year. He's got 1 reception in the last 2 games. Is he injured? Because I don't know. I haven't read anything about Barnes being injured. I'm not seeing anything about Barnes being injured. And then you watch the game last week, and Davion Dozier caught 4 passes for 140 yards and a touchdown against Oregon State. And I'm thinking to myself, that was Jaden Barnes in weeks 1, week 2, right? Is something wrong with Jaden Barnes? Or is Davion Dozier, was he a 1 week wonder? I think that that's somebody, if he has potential to produce, much like Barnes did in the first 3 weeks, and he's your new wide receiver 1 top playmaker at Appalachian State, why not go take a chance on him now? Why not add him to your roster? What's if it goes bad, it goes bad. But if you have it, you're not bidding against people on the waiver wire if he has another breakout game. Bring up Syracuse. And the reason why I want to bring up Syracuse is now I think we know why Steve Angeli was the starting quarterback. Ricky Collins hasn't looked terrible, but I don't think he's ever looked like, well, why wasn't he the starting quarterback, right? He's never given me that vibes. That vibe. The one thing that I will say, though, with Ricky Collins at quarterback is that it seems like the only player that has any fantasy appeal at this particular point is wide receiver Jonte Cook. He's caught 6 passes in each of the last 3 games. And from my eyes, that's the only consistent fantasy producer on the Syracuse roster right now. Then we go to Miami of Ohio, where Javon Tracy, back-to-back 100-yard games. People go out on the waiver wire. They think they've got a gem. Miami of Ohio looks good. They get Daquan Finn this past week. They get him back. Javon Tracy leaves after 1 rush attempt. Now, I don't have any official word on Tracy. There were some things that I read. Seems like he may have gone out the game from a non-contact injury. That's never good. But the one thing that's worth noting is that Jordan Brunson came in, carried the ball 20 times for 73 yards in that matchup against Northern Illinois. I'm not sure what's wrong with Tracy, but if he's out for an extended period of time, it does look like Jordan Brunson will get a bulk of the work in that Red Hawks backfield. And so you need to add him to your watch list if you haven't added him onto your roster already. Let's go over to Louisville. Running back Isaac Brown, 230 yards rushing, 3 touchdowns in the first 2 games of the year. Last 3 games, 104 rushing yards, no touchdowns. Now, we know because Brown barely played a couple of weeks ago, that Brown and Watson reportedly have both been banged up. Watson doesn't even have a rushing touchdown this year. I think he caught a touchdown out of the backfield in the opener in week 1. But those guys really aren't doing anything in that Louisville backfield right now. And I would assume that Brown is nicked up because he was really good last year. So was Watson. And so you have to believe the reports that those guys being banged up are legitimate. And I think we've come to the point now after the last 3 weeks where we almost need to kind of stash him on the roster, put him on the bench until we see whether or not he gets healthy and can produce again, and then bring him back out the stable. That would be my suggestion and my strategy if I had Isaac Brown right now. Talk about bringing him out the stable. Alabama gets Jam Miller back, right? Wow, 38 carries, 182 yards and a touchdown in the last 2 games, and that was against Georgia. And in its matchup against Vanderbilt, I see a big workload for Jam Miller. He's fresh. I don't think he played the first 4 weeks of the season, right? So he's not even in midseason form right now. Alabama looks good. Ty Simpson looks good. You've got Williams. You've got Bernard. You've got Horton. Alabama's got weapons. Jam Miller's going to be a fantasy factor down the line. Then we go to Texas. And I don't need to beat up Arch Manning anymore because everybody else seems to be doing it now. It's almost to the point where I feel bad for the guy. But one interesting take, and here's my take, and then this is where I'll kind of make a funny one on Texas. The end of the game, I believe they were down 8, trying to tie the game against Florida. Arch Manning gets sacked. His helmet comes off. Matthew Caldwell enters the game and throws an absolute dart. And I thought to myself, damn, that was the sharpest pass I saw thrown in that game all day. There were a couple of good passes. There were a couple Manning made and a couple Lagway made that were good. But that was like, given the time and the circumstance around that, I was like, damn, that was the sharpest pass of the game. And Florida fans just had to be saying, get Arch Manning back in the game and get this kid out of there. Here's the deal. I just don't think the Texas running game is going to be that good this year. It's a shame to say that about a Sarkisian offense. I just don't see the offensive line has the mojo. They're not moving people like I thought. You got to remember, this was a Texas team that, quite frankly, probably should have beaten Ohio State on the road in week one. They get stuffed at the goal line. Arch Manning was terrible. Texas, to me, matches up against every team in the country. And I think maybe the offensive line situation may be a product of the quarterback play, because even though Arch Manning is getting some numbers, it's almost like he's hoping that he can just run the ball on every play. He did make a couple of good throws. It looks like he got a little confidence back. He just doesn't seem like he has that it factor. And I just don't think he's the long-term solution again. I said that before. I'll say it again. But I just wanted to make that comment about Matthew Caldwell. Best thrown ball in that game by far. Everybody watching that game had to be thinking, where's this kid been? Or is he going to get a chance to play? Anyway, curious to know what you Texas fans think about that. They get Oklahoma this week, right? And so the reports are is that Mateer may be ready to play for this game against Texas. And let me tell you something. If Mateer plays and wins that game, he's already like the Heisman front runner. If he does that, he just elevates himself almost to a level above everyone else right now. Here's my take on this. I don't think Texas needs Mateer in this game to play with Texas the way that Texas is playing, particularly at the quarterback position right now. I think Oklahoma should try, I think they're better off just rolling Hawkins out there, seeing what he can do. I think Venerables is probably licking his chops right now, really coming up with a really good defensive game plan. And if you lose this game, the whole college football playoff committee knows that Mateer wasn't in there. But do you really want to risk losing Mateer for the long term anyway? I just think Hawkins start this game. I think it's still going to be a close game. I can see either team winning it. If Mateer comes in and finds a way to pull this one out, then man, you're looking by far at the Heisman front runner early on at at the midpoint of the season. But let's go to Florida, because again, the waiver wire is our friend in college fantasy football. Freshman receiver Dallas Wilson, the 6'3", 213-pound freshman, 6 catches, 111 yards, 2 touchdowns. You have to start believing now that Lagway is going to be looking for this big target, right? Like this might be the receiver that actually turns Lagway's fortunes around, because Lagway wasn't looking too good through the first few games of the season either. Is this the playmaker that he's going to need? Again, would I be willing to throw Wilson in? I think they get Texas A&M this weekend. Are you willing to do that? Not sure. But man, that guy's definitely worth a roster spot. Putting those numbers up against Texas, he may be a force down the line. Let's go to UCLA. Because for as much as I was knocking Arch Manning this year, I knocked Nico pretty bad last year. Nico, what a performance in that game against Penn State. I don't know what happened. But let me just say this. I think, we've got to remember UCLA lost to New Mexico, dominated by New Mexico. They lost to UNLV. They were handled pretty good in that game too. How do we trust Nico moving forward after that performance against Penn State where he accounted for 5 touchdowns? And I'm not sure you can. But I do know that UCLA at least has some decent matchups on their schedule in the coming weeks, that if you're willing to roll the dice and you don't have much behind them, I think Nico's going to at least give you some rushing performance and possibly a rushing touchdown every week. Where it gets a little uncertain is where that passing game comes in. Now, with the new offensive coordinator, is Quasi Gilmer back on our radar now after catching a touchdown this past weekend? Is he a player now that we need to have on our radar? it'll be interesting to see how UCLA plays coming out of this win against Penn State. Will we see the same UCLA team that we saw the first 5 weeks of the season, or have we now seen a rejuvenated, recalibrated UCLA Bruins offense? We'll find out. Old Dominion quarterback Colton Joseph is approaching legend status in college fantasy football. It's hard to look at him and just say that he's not the best college fantasy football quarterback right now. And I know we've got quarterbacks out there that are having bigger weeks. You've got Zarka. But right now, Colton Joseph is something that we just know. And that guy is just putting up big numbers every week. And here's what I would say. The when you look at Old Dominion's schedule, this week I'm a little cautious. They play at Marshall. Not that I think Marshall's going to be a tough matchup for Old Dominion. But the following week, they play at James Madison. And so this game feels like a little bit of a trap game, because when you look at Old Dominion's schedule, after that James Madison game, if they win the next two games, I don't see anybody on Old Dominion's schedule that will beat them. You're possibly looking at an 11-1 Old Dominion team whose only loss was 13 points in the season opener at Indiana. Let's kind of put that one on our board and pin it and see how that plays out. TCU wide receiver Eric McAllister. I mentioned this in my notes and observations. 2 touchdowns this past week. Fantastic. It does seem like he is battling somewhat of a nagging injury. And I think here's one of those things that we know, and we're just going to have to make the call. And that is, we know McAllister's upside when he's on the field. But we also know that there's a risk that if we start him, he may come out after a series or two if that injury is aggravated again, right? That's the hard part of college fantasy football, is that may happen. And so McAllister, I think at least until TCU has a bye, which I don't think happens again for another 3 or 4 weeks, McAllister is going to be a high risk, high reward play for you. But we see what happens when he does produce. Let's go to Texas A&M, because Texas A&M, the first couple of weeks of the season compared to now, looks like a different offense. They were much more pass heavy in the beginning of the year. Now the run game's going. Le'Veon Moss and now Reuben Owens. Looks like he's fully healthy now. Looks like he's going. Looks like he's got his legs underneath him. That could be a really scary offense with Marcel Reed. You got Concepcion, right? You've got Craver at receiver. You've got Moss. You've got Owens. You even have Daniels, who we haven't even talked about, but Moss and Owens are probably the 2 fantasy guys to look out for. And you're looking at a Texas A&M team that, had that win over Auburn. They beat Notre Dame on the road. Texas A&M is going to be a tough out for teams down the line. And we could be looking at a college football playoff team right there if they can kind of keep those pieces together. And then the last note before we get out of here, Memphis. And again, this is why I said we love college fantasy football when we were talking about, Liam Zarka on the waiver wire. But how many of us really drafted Brendan Lewis, quarterback from Memphis, who's absolutely tearing it up? Remember, we were distracted. It was like, is it DeRozier? Is it Sutton Smith at running back? And then DeRozier gets hurt, and then it's Sutton Smith for the 2 100-yard games, and then DeRozier comes in, runs for 200 yards. And personally, it looks like to me DeRozier is the running back 1, but I still think we're going to get more of a 55-45 split than we are a 50-50 or 70-30. So, but completely under the radar has gone Brendan Lewis, who has been absolutely fantastic and is a must start in college fantasy football. And that was a guy that was that probably wasn't drafted and was another waiver wire addition that has become an absolute fantasy factor and will be down the line, with Memphis making a run or trying to make a case for the college football playoff. So that's going to do it. That's the week 7 show. We're out of week. We're done with 6 weeks. We're into week 7. Again, when I look at the slate this week, more good games. We've got Indiana, Oregon. We've got Ohio State, Illinois. That could be interesting. We've got Alabama, Missouri. How's Alabama look coming off of that big win against Vanderbilt, going on the road to Missouri? And then, of course, Oklahoma, Texas. So this season has not been a disappointment. We are getting like you've got to have 2 to 3 screens set up at your house every weekend if you're going to enjoy college football the way that we like to enjoy. And that's exactly what I have. And I'll tell you what, it has not, college football has delivered every week this year. There's no reason why it won't deliver this week. But you guys need to deliver in the college fantasy football world this weekend and get things going. Good luck to everyone this week. I'll see you in week 8. Till then.